Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event. My name is Jared Mondschein. I'm the Director of Research here at the U.S. Studies Center. And before we begin, I want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. So, as many of you know, at the U.S. Studies Center, you can see what our motto is: Analysis of America, Insights for Australia, Solutions for the Alliance. And so you may be wondering, what does that have to do with Ukraine? And that's a great question. And there's a lot of debate about the relevance of the alliance and even the United States itself to Ukraine. Some people say that it's relevant to the alliance, U.S.-Australia alliance is relevant to the international rules-based order, which is a foundational principle of the alliance. Some people say that it is a matter of solidarity amongst democracies. Others say it's Australia and the United States have ethical and humanitarian responsibilities for Ukraine. I think there's a lot of debate about that, and we're going to get into that tonight. But I want to share a few quick facts that I think are relevant to this. Firstly, that North Korea has over 12,000 soldiers or estimated to have about 12,000 soldiers or more in Ukraine. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi recently, it was reported in the South China Morning Post, recently told negotiators in Europe that that China could not afford for Russia to lose in Ukraine because it would allow the United States to shift its support and resources to the Indo-Pacific. And then recently, you might have heard Undersecretary of Defense Bridge Colby in the United States, who basically helped orchestrate a pause in support for Ukraine and weapons for Ukraine from the United States, and has often cited the need for U.S. resourcing to instead be pivoted to Asia instead. I think those facts alone give us an idea that we are actually seeing issues that are very linked, regardless of how you think Ukraine should or should not be supported. I think it's undeniable that these issues are linked. Now, to discuss this all, I have a fantastic panel with us, and I'll introduce them shortly. But before I introduce them, I first want to give the floor to a friend of the United States Study Center. We know him as Vasil. You may know him as the ambassador of Ukraine to Australia. And he has joined us today on Zoom from Ukraine. And we especially appreciate it because he joined us while Keith Kellogg, a U.S. lead Ukrainian envoy, is in Ukraine. And so amidst lots of things going on, he has joined us. And if you're unfamiliar, you should know that he became or resumed the functions of the ambassador of Ukraine to Australia on April 1, 2022. On March 7th, the Minister of Defense of Ukraine appointed him as his advisor in March 7, 2022. And then in May of 2021, he was appointed as a member of the Supervisory Board of the Ukrainian Institute, a cultural diplomacy outfit of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. And I'll just say personally, there are a lot of ambassadors who we engage with at the United States Study Center. Few are as tireless and as passionate and consistent as Vasil is. And so with that, I will give the floor to you, Vasil. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jared. Thank you. Sorry I can't be with you in Sydney today. I'm currently in Ukraine, actually in the regional Ukraine, or kind of Ukrainian outback, if you wish. I mean, it's at my mother's place and her house. I'm on my way to Kyiv to attend our annual ambassadors conference next week. So I'm very pleased to be with you today for this very important discussion. But before I start with my remarks, I would like to remember the 298 innocent people which were killed 11 years ago by Russia over the sunflower fields in Ukraine. It's 11 years since MH17 tragedy when the Russian book system shot down a commercial airline, killed 38 Australians on board. And it's a very important day today for every Australian because we haven't yet seen justice in place. As you know, there is an indictment by the Dutch court of who is to blame, who is responsible, but we haven't seen the Russian government held accountable for this heinous war crime. And I think for those Australian families who are today remembering their loved ones, it's important to see that justice is delivered. And not only the justice of their compensation, because nothing can compensate a lost life, but a compensation of accountability of Russian President Vladimir Putin for the war crimes. Just like for every Ukrainian, we want to see Russian president held accountable for the crime of aggression. Crime of aggression in international relations is probably the worst crime which is out there. And Ukraine, jointly with our partners, including Australia, are pursuing that accountability in the international legal system, which is certainly not perfect, but that's all we have. As well as we will be prosecuted and are prosecuting Russia for the crimes against humanity, for numerous war crimes committed in Ukraine on a daily basis. Well, I disagree with your title, which is Can Ukraine Survive? And I would rather put a different title, what Australia should do for Ukraine to succeed. What should Australia do to help Ukraine prevail? What should Australia do to help Ukraine win? I think it's a very important change of the topic. And I would like to argue in the next 5 minutes of why Australia should be fighting for not only Ukraine's survival, but should be fighting for us to win. I think in this past 3.5 years, it's been pretty clear of the connection that we are now seeing in European security, but also in the global security. I remember in 2022 and even in 2023, many politicians in Australia have told me privately, but also publicly, that Ukraine is a long way away. It's not our war. We have nothing to do with that. It's up to NATO. It's up to Europe to deal with that. We certainly will be helping, but it's not our war, right? And I think now is actually everything has changed. Actually, it turns out that the war is next door. It turns out that the war is much closer than many of the Australian politicians thought, because we see Russians are already organizing joint military exercises in Indonesia, and it's been only in November of last year, 1,300 kilometers away from Darwin. We see Russians are requesting Indonesian government to provide an airfield in Papua to refuel strategic bombers, which are capable of carrying nuclear weapons. For now, the leadership of Indonesia has declined to that request, but maybe next year they will accept it. We don't know, but it's of huge concern to Australia and must be of huge concern to Australia. We see how North Korean troops are currently fighting in Ukraine, fighting against Ukraine, helping Russians not only with ammunition, but also with the personnel, with missiles. We see how Russians are paying back the North Koreans. They're sending money, they're sending technology, they're sending, and most importantly, North Koreans are learning the war, the modern war, the war which is currently only Ukrainians and Russians know how to fight. It's a new war. It all has changed in the last 3.5 years. And probably the most equipped and the most capable armies in the world is the Ukrainian army and the Russian army. The problem with Russia is that Russia is sharing that knowledge with North Korea, with Iran, with China. And we see it already out there, how these countries will become stronger, more equipped. They will have the most advanced technology, which is currently only available in the Ukrainian battlefield. The same for us. We have the new technology, which thanks to the support of many countries, including the support of the Australian government, for which we are very thankful. You know, I'm currently in Ukraine. I already spent 2 weeks in Ukraine previously. So this is my already 3rd week in Ukraine. And let me tell you, every Ukrainian who I see, they tell me, Vasil, make sure you thank Australians and New Zealanders who are supporting Ukraine, the government, the people, different groups. We feel that support. We are very thankful for that support. because for countries which are 15,000 kilometers away, who feel our pain, it's extremely uplifting for the Ukrainian people to see that support. And certainly now that we get this support in military tech and defense tech, we take it, we test it, we see what works, we improve it, we make it better, and we make it efficient. So if you look at the autonomous systems and the way Ukrainians have been able to deploy those autonomous systems underwater, on the ground, in the air, you will realize that Ukraine is currently has the most cutting edge technology, which is battle tested, it's efficient, it works. About 2 months ago, Ukrainian underwater drone went into the port of Novorossiysk, which is a Russian military port on the Black Sea, and from underwater it shot down a Russian fighter jet. I would like to repeat that. A Ukrainian underwater drone shot down a Russian fighter jet from underwater. This is science fiction. 3 years ago, nobody thought it was possible. We've delivered that. You've seen our spiderweb operation where we have been able to destroy 30% of the Russian strategic bombers 5,000 kilometers away from the border, from the battlefield. Can anyone do it now? Is Ukraine capable of demonstrating that we can fight? What else we have to do? What else we have to demonstrate to prove that we can fight? I think now the future of Australia depends on Ukrainian survival. And this is where my punchline is. Because if Ukraine does not survive, I think Australia has no chance of surviving. You have to understand that if Ukraine is gone, if we go into the jungle or where the might is right, where there are no rules, where only strong survive, Australia has no chance. You have no nuclear weapons. You don't know how to fight. I mean, this is just, there is no protection. I mean, this is just very sad, but I'm not even mentioning your neighbors who are so vulnerable everywhere, in the Pacific, in New Zealand. And Australia has a vested interest in making sure that we can win, in making sure that we can hold Russia accountable, in making sure that we can renew the rules-based international order, which has been dismantled so brutally by Putin. And I don't see any chance of anywhere in the near future of coming back to any rules. I mean, there are no rules in a way. And in this world of a jungle where the might is right, the strength is defined by your defense capabilities, by your military capabilities. And we see how countries in the region have become extremely strong. They build the largest navy. There is so many military capabilities, borrowing knowledge from Russia in how to fight. Will North Koreans invade South Korea? Will North Koreans get emboldened if Ukraine falls? Of course they will. Of course they will. And what does it mean for Australia? How is Australian trade going to develop with China, with Japan, with South Korea if there is a war on the Korean Peninsula? Will it be paralyzed? Well, will Australia sell its products? Will Australia be able to buy its fuel from Singapore? What if everything is paralyzed and China is invading Taiwan or just blocking Taiwan? How is that going to impact your trade? Even if you remain neutral, even if you're just an observer, economy of Australia is driven by commodities. The commodities which, thanks to the war of Russia in Ukraine, you've been able to make at least 100 billion extra dollars from this war in the first 2 years of war, just sheerly by the surging prices for iron ore, shale gas, oil, and all other products which you're exporting. You've been able to make more money, which just because of the way the commodity market works. And because of instability, uncertainty, your products have gone up and you've been able to make more money, which is just a positive externality for the Australia. And I think this is great that you've been able to make more money on this war. But for us, it's a matter of survival, and we have to be fighting for. Since we're here talking about America and Australia and Ukraine, I want to specifically talk about international political economy to diverge a bit from geopolitics and defense. I think on the international political economy side, we firstly see how America is revisiting its alliances, and these alliances both in defense, security, but also in trade and investment and the future. And certainly the connections which exist between America and Australia are very strong, and I pray that they remain so strong forever. At the same time, what's important is that we are all prepared. and we all prepared, we built the resilience, and we built the strong armies, because it just looks like it's the only thing which can deter any war in the future. It's when you have right weapons, when you have strong army, and you can deter any potential aggression in the region, and you can make sure that you're respected and your rights are respected. It looks like it's the only solution that Ukraine has, which, as you know, has voluntarily given up its nuclear weapons over 30 years ago, in exchange for its sovereignty to be respected. And what did we get? We got a war. So now, talking about international political economy, I would like to specifically talk about the recently signed minerals deal between Australia and between the US and Ukraine. And as you know, as part of the minerals deal, is a mechanism for US and Ukrainian government to invest in the Ukrainian natural resources, some of that including critical minerals, some of them including rare earth minerals, but also other resources, natural resources, which are available in Ukraine, which needs to be explored, which need to be extracted, processed, and delivered to the markets in Europe and the US. And I think in this deal that we currently have between US and Ukraine, we need Australia there. And this is my argument. I still believe that Australia sees an opportunity here, because if you look into the mining sector, just for starters, as you know, Australia is the Saudi Arabia of the mining sector globally. And I think both US and Ukraine will really welcome the contribution from the Australian engineering companies who can help us to develop the resources which we have, and most importantly, to process those resources. As you know, the bottleneck in processing all the resources is all out there. It's cheap labor, it's cheap energy, and its accessibility to the market. I mean, everybody got lithium in the world. I mean, Indonesia has more lithium than anybody can consume. But we also have graphite in Ukraine. The largest deposits of graphite in Europe are currently in Ukraine. And actually, as a matter of fact, it's owned by a publicly listed company from Australia called Volt Resources, which is ASX listed company. They invested just 2 months before the war. But graphite, if you know, in any battery production, you need more graphite than you need lithium. And I think Ukraine can contribute to that energy security of Europe and globally with our resources, but also some of the rare earth minerals like beryllium, like some other ones which we have in Ukraine, but we need your help to process. We have cheap energy. We rely on nuclear energy. Nuclear power is still a big part of the power generation. It's probably the cheapest energy that we have. You may be aware that we are sourcing uranium in Australia. Uranium is enriched in France and Sweden and is supplied to Ukraine. In the future, we'll have more of that and we'll need more of the nuclear power. But nuclear power is the cheapest power you can get, and we can process any rare earth minerals or critical minerals in Ukraine using Australian technology, using Australian money, together with American money, of course, and Ukrainian funds, to process critical minerals, supply them to Europe, supply them to the US, to Australia, anywhere you need. And I think this is just one of the examples of how we can promote this cooperation between Australia, Ukraine, and the US on the critical minerals side. But there are many other opportunities. You know, I was at the Ukraine Recovery Conference in Rome last week, and we were discussing, and there was a huge conference, 5,000 people there. I was very pleased that Dr. Andrew Forrest was able to attend. He recommitted $500 million to Ukraine's rebuild and reconstruction. His private foundation is announced another contribution of about $5 million to Ukraine's demining. But he remains very persistent in his desire to contribute to Ukraine's rebuild of our energy infrastructure, of our housing infrastructure. And by the way, in terms of renewable energy, we'll need a lot of that renewable energy. We are now creating a pipeline of how you can invest in hydropower, in wind power, in solar power. And we'll need a lot of that green renewable energy to be rebuilt. Russians have destroyed a lot of that. And of course, Russians have destroyed our traditional gas and coal-driven power generation. So we'll need that energy angle out there. Look, I mean, I can probably carry on for a long time, but I would like to make a summary. And my summary is the following. I mean, we are very closely interlinked. Our future is very closely interlinked. We have to be fighting together for Ukraine's survival. And we have to actually change the way we talk about it. Of course, it's difficult for people. You know, I talk to Just my classmate today is there is a funeral for my classmate from my little village where I grew up. He died actually. He was missing for 2 years, and more recently, his remnants were discovered. And there is a big funeral in my hometown, which is a city of 20,000 people. And it's today, as we speak, the ceremony is taking place. And when you think about it, and when you ask those people how they feel, you can go and talk to my classmate's daughter and ask her. Of course, it's tough. We get killed. What we are asking from Australia is to send more money, send more weapons, provide more energetics, send more Bushmasters. We're thankful for the tanks. As you know, Australian government has donated 49 tanks last year. A big chunk of them have been, already in Europe. They're transferred very shortly to Ukraine at the moment. This is a very significant contribution, and we will always be thankful to Australia for that. We will never forget it. But there's so much at stake. There's so much where you have a skin in the game for the way it's going to develop. And we have to change the way we talk about it. It's about Ukraine's prevailing. It's about the accountability of the aggressor. It's not just, oh, let's just stop it. Let's get a ceasefire. Let's just agree to everything. Let's just stop the bloodshed. It's the wrong thinking, because the bloodshed and stopping of bloodshed is not solving the issue. And the issue is that aggressors watch it, and they will be emboldened. Those authoritarian leaders in the region, there are plenty, all Southeast Asia is all autocracies. They just watch it of how this is going to develop, and they will use it for their own benefit. Because if Russia is allowed to do what they have done, any other country can do it, and they can just basically draw that experience. And I'm not even mentioning nuclear countries, which are permanent members of the UN Security Council, right? Because it's like a roadmap for them now. So look, I mean, on this a little bit, emotional moment, I would like to finish. And I wish you a very good discussion. I hope I was thought-provoking enough to have a good discussion there in the room. I will be back in Australia in 2 weeks and look forward to talking and engaging with US Study Center in Sydney further. There are many friends there that I have. There are many issues that I'd love to discuss with you all. But for now, I wish you a good discussion and see you in 2 weeks.
Great. Thank you so much, Vasil. That was fantastic. I really appreciate it. Again, as I was saying to the audience, if you want to see a masterclass of a diplomat representing their country with integrity, but also passion, Vasil is that. And I think if there's one thing that his comments reminded me of is the famous Trotsky quote that you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. So that was fantastic. Now we're going to move to the panel discussion. And I have a fantastic, I have a fantastic group joining me this evening. And only one of them is actually based in Sydney. And so we're so lucky to have distinguished guests with us this evening. I'll start far left with Gorana Grgić, who is a senior lecturer in U.S. politics and foreign policy with us at the United States Studies Center. But she's currently in residence as a senior researcher with the Swiss and Euro-Atlantic security team at the ETH Zurich Center for Security Studies. She's also an expert associate with the ANU National Security College. She is also one of my favorite colleagues at the U.S. Studies Center and is one of Australia's leading experts on NATO. Next, we have Olga Boichak, and she is a senior lecturer in digital cultures at the University of Sydney and a Ukrainian-born sociologist researching the role of information and communication technologies in shaping public perception and outcomes of wars. And she currently serves as director of the Ukrainian Studies Foundation in Australia and is on the list of prominent Australians personally sanctioned by the Kremlin. So we have a celebrity. I'd also say that she is currently on maternity leave, and I, being the obnoxious American, got her to come out of maternity leave to speak tonight. Lastly, but certainly not least, we have Matt Sussex, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Defense Research and at the Australian Defence College and an associate professor of the Griffith Asia Institute at Griffith University and a visiting fellow at the Strategic and Defence Studies Center, ANU. His research specializations revolve around national security and strategic studies with a particular focus on Russia and Eurasia, great power foreign policies, and hybrid and information warfare. And he also is, in many ways, Australia's leading expert on Russia. So we have a stellar panel with you this evening, and I'll go ahead and get started on questions. Just give me 1 sec. All right. So, can folks hear me all right? Great. So I want to start off. We got a whole range of facts and figures and arguments from Basil, but I just want to start at the very beginning. February 2022. There were a lot of guesses about what was going to happen next. This is over 3 years ago. And I'd love to hear, given that each of you are experts on this topic, were you actually shocked that the invasion occurred? And what did you think when it occurred was going to be the most likely outcome? Maybe we'll start with Gorana and then move our way down. Or you want to, Matt starts? Let's start with Matt, and then we'll change it up next time.
No worries. Can you hear me okay? I tend to shout anyway, so this is more or less worthless. I should have thrown it away before.
We are on YouTube, so it is helpful.
Okay, no problem. Look, it's one of the few things I actually got right in terms of prediction when it came to Russia. I said to a lot of my colleagues in Canberra, look, I actually think that this war is going to happen. I think Putin's going to invade. And they said, no, you're stupid. Yeah, absolutely not. The reason I thought that it was going to happen was some of the things that the Russians were doing that they hadn't done previously when it came to exercises. And one of the chief things about that was moving blood supplies very close to the front. Now, generally speaking, they don't do that. They don't bother when they're having exercises because it's simply too much of a logistical problem. But they were doing that. And the other thing they were doing was integrating Chechens and Spetsnaz special forces within their regular forces as well, and training together. And typically they don't do that either. And so it suggested to me that, in fact, that this might happen. But when it came to the actual invasion, I was like everybody else and absolutely got wrong. I suppose like Vladimir Putin got wrong. Number one, the quality of the Russian military. Number two, which he said was the second, well, he said it was the second best in the world. I think, the last few years have demonstrated it's about the 32nd at least. The second thing, I completely underestimated the capacity and the will of Ukrainians to resist. Putin was told by his intelligence services that their soldiers would be greeted with flowers rather than by Molotov cocktails. And I certainly underestimated that. And I also underestimated the strength of Western resolve to actually do something more than tokenistic sanctions and decide finally enough is enough, and the Ukraine needs to be armed and needs to be assisted, at least to the extent where it is able to resist the Russian invasion, if not win. And of course, that's always been the sticking point. But no, that's one of the only things I ever got right in terms of predicting in Russia. The only other thing was when I was a PhD student and I said to my supervisor, Boris Yeltsin's getting very old and sick. I reckon this guy from the secret from the intelligence services might succeed him. He's called Vladimir Putin. And my supervisor said, "You're an absolute moron." He was right about all other occasions, but just not that one.
Excellent, thank you, Olga.
Like Matt, I was one of the few people who were extremely concerned to see the Russian military build up on Ukraine's borders. And the reason for that is that I've been looking at Russia's hybrid, well, pardon the use of the term, but hybrid warfare measures since 2011, 12, 13, before Crimea got annexed, and I saw things that really concerned me. Of course, one of those things was the actual military buildup. The vans to transport bodies that were also brought promptly to the Ukrainian border, that did suggest that Putin was serious about it. At the same time, there was Putin's infamous speech on the historical unity of Ukrainians and Russians, and that is how I knew it was going to happen. It was an extremely tedious speech, if you remember it. It was long and oh boy. But yes, that is how we understood. And of course, I was very angry, I guess, at a lot of our colleagues who were complacent, who said, "Oh, this is just strongman diplomacy. This is posturing." And of course, when everything started, it was the continuation of the 2014 playbook. In a sense, it was accompanied by massive cyber attacks. It was accompanied by other infrastructural damages, strategic infrastructural damages. And that was something that, on one hand, introduced lots of chaos, lots of very fertile environment for disinformation, but on the other hand, allowed Ukrainians to well, I guess, practice some network-based warfare as it was all unfolding. So work in little swarms, and those were the early days of the war that allowed Ukraine to essentially repeal the aggression.
And just to clarify that 2014, you mean the invasion of Crimea by Russia, which is a small-scale invasion, but nonetheless still an invasion.
Yes, the non-invasion of Crimea by Russia,
Right.
and then the invasion into the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, the creation of the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics that, yes, were also accompanied with very fertile information operations that, well, had some fertile ground.
Right. Thank you. Gorana.
So was I thinking that the invasion would or re-invasion would happen? I think my batting average on these things that, you know, like Donald Trump's election in 2016 or Brexit or this, like it's, don't bet on what I'm betting. You're losing money, definitely. There was, of course, there were a lot of, at the time, I remember the weeks leading up to it, I was in Europe actually, and this is completely not about me, but I happened to have been sort of between Croatia and Italy, and I was in Croatia on February the 24th, and the weeks leading up to it, there was a lot of intelligence that was coming from everywhere, right? About things, all of the sort of things that already Matt and Olga very eloquently explained in terms of these warning signs. But I was actually thinking that if something is going to happen, it might be more as a result of some sort of mistake rather than a kind of strategic sort of decision, let's say, that this is going to happen on a particular Thursday, because before that there were, you know, is it going to be a Tuesday or Wednesday? There were all these sort of, you know, like the Kremlinology also employing, you know, what, like when Putin woke up that day, what it meant and things like that. Yeah, from that perspective, the way that it happened and just the, you know, incredulity that a lot of us, I think, across especially Southeastern Europe, especially kind of my parts of the world, the way that this looked like in 21st century Europe, when we have so many times said never again, was something that was truly left a lot of people in disbelief. And then just to sort of add on to what Matt was already saying, I think that what was most surprising to many of us was just the first assessments that, you know, maybe Ukraine has a couple of days, you know, and that this is you know, the kind of money was definitely on sort of Russia's momentum and so on. But it soon became clear, I think, even by the end of that weekend, as Ukraine was standing still and actually resisting that this would be something that, you know, is not going to be as linear and straightforward. And maybe just on that note, in terms of the you know, we've heard just from the ambassador as well, in terms of where we are at this moment, just to appreciate the fact that we now have this sort of alliance of authoritarians or kind of an axis of authoritarians where you do have North Korean troops on basically European borders, right? To kind of think about that with this sort of passing of 3 years, but also that you have the counter mobilization of, I would say, a lot of the cross-regional, cross-theater cooperation among democracies that want to see Ukraine survive and prosper is something that we really couldn't believe. And as someone who spends quite a lot of time, on both of these continents, to me, it's been really one of the positive surprises, the way that this has generated change in terms of the mindset here in Australia, because certainly 10 years ago, a little bit more than 10 years ago, the ambassador already alluded to downing of MH17, the sort of discussions, like Tony Abbott was shirt fronting Putin at the Brisbane G20 summit and all that. But things fell off, the agenda. Europe was definitely not something that was kind of seen as a priority. And these days we see a lot more, and again, I can speak only about things that I specialize in, but the fact that you see now NATO featuring prominently, the kind of cooperation with Indo-Pacific 4, with Australia, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, this has produced a sea change in terms of strategic thinking. And it's quite something for people who are in security studies. It's quite a difference to where we were before in terms of this sort of commonality of purpose and analogies between Ukraine and potentially, any kind of contingency, whether it's, Taiwan or South China Sea, that really has been sort of brought in the forefront.
Thank you. Yeah, I as an American, I still don't know what shirt fronting means, and no one can really.
I don't know either, and I have an Australian passport, so there you go.
I guess one thing before we move on to individual questions for each of you based on your backgrounds, I'd love to know. A lot of times, I find when I'm supposed to know something, I'll literally be walking towards an elevator, and someone will be like, "What's actually happening with this?" And I'm like, "How much time do you have for me to explain everything?" But maybe if I could get each of you to give a quick elevator pitch on where things currently stand, in terms of 3 years after we talked about what you were shocked by in the beginning, maybe what you underestimated, and so maybe we can start with Gorana and work our way down.
Yeah, I would say that where things stand is we are for some time now stuck in this sort of debate of which side is winning or losing, right? Where are we exactly, tactically? How much has Russia gained on the battlefield and so on? And all of these discussions, I would preface them by saying, if we look at what Putin's goals were originally when he was talking about the historical unity, right? Those strategic goals that he had back then have not been fulfilled, right? Ukraine is still standing, and basically the kind of territory that is being contested is certainly way less in terms of the ambitions that were there from day one. But that's not to say that there isn't, of course, a struggle that is daily, that this is a war of attrition. We actually have now in June seen the highest number of civilian casualties since the beginning of the reinvasion, of the escalation in 22 in Ukraine. So basically, for all the talk of let's go to the negotiating table, there is this sort of conscious move, I would say, and calculated move that Putin has made, which is, escalate to sort of de-escalate, to try to extract more concessions. And, I'm sure we are going to get to sort of US response now on some of these things, but this is where we are. And in terms of where we are, I would say, again, I think that the ambassador really gave us a very rich sort of tapestry there in terms of where we can pull. But just one thing to appreciate is the revolution in the conduct of war, with just the ability of Ukrainians to actually resist through innovation at the speed of need, at the speed of the way that actually things are unraveling on the battlefield. And I think this is truly, I hate talking about, wars that are going on, which have real people, real people's lives, again, as we heard, as some sort of laboratory. It's not a laboratory, it's a real life setting, right? But the fact that all of the world is learning now from what Ukrainians have been able to do. And I think this sort of ingenuity, the ability to actually innovate, to defend themselves, drone warfare, you know, where it has gone, both the sort of on the kind of aerial, but also subwater front. These are the things that are very much at, you know, kind of the forefront of what we are discussing. And, you know, you throw in now the kind of marriage of those things, autonomous weaponry together with AI, for instance, and things progressing on that front. At the same time, this being, again, a war of attrition, where sometimes the kind of footage that's coming out as well is, you know, Russian soldiers trying to conquer territory on bicycles or motorbikes. So it is a kind of strange marriage of, we have trench warfare, you know, kind of World War I style, but we also have now these sort of discussions, where do we actually keep humans in the loop with the autonomous weapons systems? So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Olga?
So where I think I would like to extend what Gorana has been saying, because where we are at the moment is that Russia has completely reconfigured its economy to military ends. And while we hear different facts that otherwise it's doing pretty poorly, which it is, Russia's ability to produce military weaponry is still pretty significant. And they also have pretty much unlimited human resources to tap into to fuel the subsequent waves of mobilization. So the fact that the European countries are now expected to raise their defense budget to 5%, that had to be done like 10 years ago. That was the calculus for the peaceful times. And in my opinion, anything that Europe does now will still be marginal compared to what Russia is already doing. And so we know that they've also involved their strategic partners, that North Korea, like the ambassador said, is testing their technologies on the battleground, that Iran is actively cooperating. There's Chinese advanced weapons manufacturing already on Russian territory. So this is where we are now. Ukrainians are able to quickly adapt. They're able to quickly innovate and involve different private partners and scale the innovation quickly. I would like to draw one example because I think it is phenomenal. That is an example from civilian tech. It's an app that's called e-Air Defense, EPPO, where basically the app uses crowdfunding. Every Ukrainian citizen can authorize themselves through the app, kind of like we do in Service New South Wales or MyGov, and they're able to map a flying object overhead in the real time. And it doesn't only show the trajectory of the kind of crowdsourced mapping, it also, the app also models that trajectory and is able to warn all of the app users on the missile's pathway to go into shelters. So in a way, it is just phenomenal how this works. It's phenomenal how, just in the real time, how it is able to warn the civilians. But unfortunately, yes, like Gorana said, it is a war of attrition, and Ukraine really needs a lot of allies' support to continue fighting. I saw an interesting statistic that at the pace that Putin is conquering Ukrainian territory, they will need something like 200 years. I don't think that's going to be the case much longer. I think we should be more alarmed than we are now.
Thank you. Yeah.
Look, let me pick up on something slightly different, I suppose, and make some reference to what Vasil was saying about the need to resolve the root causes of this war. I think it's fairly obvious that the root causes of the war will not be resolved if we end up with some kind of partial peace settlement in which the battle lines are, pretty much fixed where they are.
Sorry, just to interrupt
Yep.
you. I think we should maybe clarify for the audience that root cause is what Vladimir Putin likes to say is necessary for any sort of settlements involving the United States. And
I'm getting there. Don't worry.
Sorry.
I'm getting there. So, drawing a line on the map based on where the troop dispositions are now is absolutely not going to resolve this conflict. It will be a frozen conflict. There will be attempts by Russia to conquer more of Ukraine by subterfuge, by political warfare. There will be an enormous resistance effort by Ukrainians on illegally gotten land controlled by Russia. Let's face it, Crimea is Ukrainian, Donetsk is Ukrainian, and so is Luhansk. But these are very, very unlikely to transpire. And we hear a lot, I think, about Putin's desire for peace, Putin's desire to come to the negotiating table. Putin has not changed his position one iota since prior to invading Ukraine. And the worry here is that we keep thinking that he wants off-ramps, and he doesn't want off-ramps. He wants to continue because he thinks he is winning. And he also thinks that he is winning the information war, in which his view of root causes of the conflict are that this was all NATO's fault, right? NATO, encroaching closer and closer to Russian territory, created a condition whereby poor Russia had no option but to invade Ukraine full scale. Now, of course, that's absolutely nonsense. And if you don't believe me, you can believe Vladimir Putin, who said a couple of years ago, in fact, that the reason his troops were in Ukraine was that in the past, Catherine the Great and Peter the Great united Russian lands, and now it's time for us to take our historic lands back. And just a couple of weeks ago, in fact, he echoed one of the common catechisms of Russian ultranationalists, which was that everywhere a Russian soldier's boots land belongs to Russia. So there is absolutely no question that this is a war of imperial aggression. The question becomes, how do you engineer a position where Ukraine is able to survive in a way that is viable? Because Putin's view is that he doesn't have to conquer all of Ukraine. He just has to basically cut it off from the Black Sea. And if he does that, he makes the supply of grain and critical minerals extraordinarily difficult and extraordinarily expensive, right? So this is why it is absolutely crucial that those countries, and I wouldn't just say democracies, actually, I would say those countries that value transparency and accountability are the ones that are fundamentally at risk from this alignment of authoritarian states, particularly Russia, but including others as well. That's why it's absolutely urgent that we do continue to aid Ukraine to the best of our abilities, because, as Olga says, the assumption that the Ukrainians can resist forever is a false one. We are starting to get really to the pointy end of this. The Russians have simply have more people that they can throw into the meat grinder, and they also, unfortunately, have allies that are helping. The North Koreans are supplying an estimated 40% of all of Russian munitions being used at the front now. So this is something that we do need to take very, very seriously.
So they have an ideology, they have allies supporting them, and they have a retooled economy that now is focused on this war effort. But maybe, Matt, if I could drill a bit further down on the military, what is a realistic military objective for Ukraine right now? You hear a lot from the United States, or at least from President Trump, I should say, about how they should settle. What is actually Ukraine's military objectives as it stands today?
Well, Ukraine has basically rewritten the book when it comes to modern strategic art and modern operational art as well, particularly with how the weak can win wars through a variety of things. Raids into Ukrainian territory. More than that, Russian territory, I beg your pardon. More than that, large-scale assaults into Russian territory, capturing large pieces of Kursk, which could be used potentially as bargaining chips in any negotiated settlement. I think from the Ukrainian perspective, the military pathway looks a lot like what it's continuing to do, which is to attrit Russian oil and gas capacity, to put a fair bit of hurt on its logistics supply chain, to also be able to conduct strikes deep into Russia to remind people that this war is not just a war happening in Ukraine. Because if you're in Moscow or St. Petersburg, for a lot of people there, the war just doesn't touch their lives. What you need to do is to make that war hurt the Ukrainians need to make that war heard in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, where there are places of political power. And that takes it beyond the military dimension and makes it much more of a political one. But I think that this is the lesson that Ukrainians have taught us. And that is that fundamentally they have been viewing the conflict strategically from the get-go. And as the weaker part player, they have to do that. The Russians have often been focused very much on tactics and operations and so forth, and in doing so revealed a lot of flaws and a lot of inability to adapt. The adaptability of the Ukrainians has been phenomenal. Whether they can go that extra step and put real political pressure on Vladimir Putin, whether they can do sufficient damage to Russia's ability to resupply its troops. It's not just having troops that are there that are important, but it's being able to supply them to do things, right? That will give, you would think, Putin some pause if they are successful. But if they're not successful, then we will see, I think, this gradual and increasing in terms of pace ability of the Russians to take Ukrainian territory.
So asymmetrical warfare, the way to go.
Well, asymmetry and symmetry in a way.
Yeah.
You know, it's all of the above, right? So it's drone warfare meets trench warfare meets gray zone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Olga, as a Ukrainian, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how Ukraine's national identity has shifted since the invasion. I remember in terms of just shifting ideas about Ukraine itself. I remember the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, who famous in 2014. He talked about how important it was that if you asked him for his big takeaway, one of his biggest achievements as ambassador was removing from American lexicon the Ukraine, and how just that idea that the Ukraine actually implied that it was sort of like a suburb of Russia instead of its own identity. I'd love to hear how has Ukrainian identity changed since 2022? Are there more divisions? Is there more unity? Sort of the social and cultural aspects of this, I'd love to hear.
We've come a long way since 2014. Thankfully, we do not need to correct many speakers now. That is not the Ukraine, and there's a good understanding about Ukraine's sovereignty and why it is not appropriate to say that. Ukrainian national identity is a very dynamic phenomenon, and from the start of Ukraine's renewed independence in 1991, there was not a lot of attention that was spent on Ukrainian national identity in the state. And I think the first president who really took to thinking about these things and trying to sort of create institutional frameworks for the Ukrainian identity to develop was Ukraine's third president, Yushchenko. So before that time, unfortunately, there were discrepancies. I wouldn't call Ukraine divided. We often see those maps where there's like half of Ukraine, the Western Ukraine doing this and Eastern Ukraine doing this. They're really reductionist. However, at the beginning, so throughout the 90s and maybe up to mid 2000s, under 50% of Ukrainian identified primarily as citizens of Ukraine. So a lot of them had different ethnic, regional identities. People just expressed themselves in multiple ways. That all changed in 2014 when everybody got together on Maidan and really experienced that unity for the first time. And that is, I would say, where Ukraine's nation building project really took off. And then in 2022, it became much more defined. So while in 2014, we could argue whether there were different diverging visions that many people had about, for example, what is the status of the Russian language in Ukraine? Can Ukraine be a bilingual country? Can Ukraine emulate maybe multiculturalism in Canada? And is that how all the ethnic minorities in Ukraine would coexist and interact? After 2022, it's radically shifted. There is right now over 80% of Ukrainians acknowledge Ukrainian as their native language. That is significantly up. That's up by more than 15% from 2014. And the reason for that is just rejection, outright rejection of Russia and everything Russian. So those ideas probably could be considered somewhat extreme in 2014, where there was still not a clear understanding of the Ukrainian identity. It was already a very strong civic identity, but it was not not defined in terms of culture. So I would say after 2022, culture has become extremely important, right? Because this war is also perpetrated by cultural means, by information means. This is where Ukrainians realize that they should be united in the face of the enemy. They should defend their identity, defend their ability to be Ukrainian in these circumstances. And also there's substantive changes in the citizenships, in the Ukrainian citizenship. So these issues of, for example, what does a Ukrainian citizen do? What are the Ukrainian citizens' duties? They were much less pronounced than now. There's much more trust, there's much more solidarity. And this is a country where there's been a lot of fractures along the social fabric, just because of the way of the Soviet Union, just because of the way that trust had been systematically decimated for decades and decades. Right now, Ukraine is coming out of this much more united, much more stronger, with very strong sense of duty as Ukrainian citizenships, with very strong sense of identity, not an ethno-nationalist identity, but a civic identity of a Ukrainian. And I guess with a strong outlook of where that will be in the future. So it's been quite remarkable to watch these changes, and this is just a space to watch, because there's a lot of renaissance happening culturally in Ukraine right now at the backdrop of the war.
Thank you. Gorana, I might go to you now for a sort of double bill question. Firstly, as an international relations scholar, what's at stake for this international system, this rules-based order that we've heard so much about, if Ukraine fails to survive as an independent? That's on one hand. And the other is maybe that response where we're seeing Europe pledging, as we've heard, 5%, 3.5%, depending on how you define defense spending. What are the implications for Ukraine of Europe doing that? I mean, Olga said they should have done that 10 years ago, and I think every U.S. president for the last 30 years would have agreed with that. But yeah, just double bill if that's all right.
For the last 75 years, I would say, there are some National Security Council documents that, I think already with Truman start, but definitely Kennedy was already noticing that Europeans should do more. Look, the first question is a big one. It's the sort of your favorite sort of 5,000 word essay to kind of whole PhD thesis about whether there was ever such a thing as a liberal international order or rules-based order, right? Often rhapsodized, very rarely scrutinized, applied to particular parts of the world at particular points in time. But there is something there for sure, if you're subscribing to some sort of constructivist idea that we bought into this sort of set of rules and norms, that we talked about it, that we performed around these sort of ideas, where it seems now, to borrow from Gramsci, that old world is dying, the new one hasn't been born, and it is the time of monsters, right? You hear that a lot these days. And so that's where I would place us now. This is truly that kind of messy middle where I would say the re-invasion, the escalation of war, of Russia's war in Ukraine is a symptom rather than a cause of these things, right? Because we've seen that for some time now that different revisionist powers are testing, right? They're testing how much they can go. And, we have now alluded to a couple of times to what was going on in 2014. And Olga already said, how we've actually adapted as well in terms of the language that we use. The fact that the illegal annexation of Crimea happened, right? But that this is something that, we sort of accepted that, again, of all continents, Europe kind of truly, again, kind of having that memory of all the great wars and so on, that this is, again, something that happened and we sort of moved on, right? The sanctions were in place, deals were made, to have ceasefire and so on, but nothing really stopped Putin, right? Like in terms of these root causes, we didn't address that. And the root cause is the sort of Russian neo-imperialism, again, that is manifested in this sort of revisionist behavior. And so the ambassador already spoke, and I think his sentence was, the future of Australia is fought in Ukraine, right? It is going to be decided in Ukraine. If Ukraine doesn't hold this is a signal, right, in that kind of Thucydidean manner that the strong can do what they can, right? The weak will suffer what they must, and it will send signals that will reverberate far beyond European shores and borders. And this is something that, again, if we are serious, again, as citizens of democracies or countries that still believe that there should be rules that we agree upon, that there are certain norms that should guide the conduct of states that we agreed upon following the end of World War II, then this is a big deal. The problem now is that we've for some time seen that, again, all of those things have been sort of re-examined, tested in different ways. I would argue that, the leaders of three biggest nuclear powers today are all in different ways a bit revisionist about their place in the world. And this is not a good thing if you want to sort of have a sense of stability, right? Who is there to pick up the pieces? And that's where your second question, or the kind of, where does Europe fall into all of this? That was Margaret Thatcher. I'm sorry, I'm throwing out all these quotes, but yeah, Margaret Thatcher was the one with there's no such thing as society, right? And I will say there's no such thing as Europe. Europe is many things, right? I mean, there is on a map, but how do you define it these days, right? Is Europe the EU? Is Europe something EU plus? Is Europe maybe sometimes even Canada, right? I mean, there are also these wacky discussions these days that, Canada could become potentially the 28 member states. Anyway, but leaving that aside, so who is there to pick up the pieces? Europe certainly is trying to do that, but as it's doing that, it needs to answer some of the sort of big questions in terms of its integration. How deep, how broad, right? Who is there to do that? And are they actually capable to do that? Or is it going to be down to a couple of these unilateral sort of arrangements where it's like the European three, the E3, which is Germany, France, and Britain, or the E5, you add to that mix Italy and Poland? Or is it going to be something much broader? Because these days, actually, the Scandies and the Balts, right, the Nordics and the Baltics are really, they are living that, right? But the issue is then in terms of Europe, and that's where I am these days, even though I live in Switzerland, which is another thing, Switzerland is not part of any of these discussions. So I'm in Europe, but not part of any of these integrations. But, there is a strategic cacophony, because if you're sitting in Poland, your strategic threat assessment is much different than if you're in Portugal, right? And unless we sort of bridge some of these gaps and divides, it's going to be very hard. So just to get to your question very, very quickly, I think that this is really important to sort of inject into Australian public and media discourse about the significance of these 5% that were pledged at the recent NATO summit in The Hague, which in my opinion, was sort of an exercise in the lowest common denominator on which the allies can agree on. In 427 words of that communique that came out, the statement out of the summit, which was the shortest in post-Cold War history of NATO, which is basically to say we agree on the very basics, right? Ukraine was mentioned twice, Russia was mentioned once. Some see it as a win that, NATO said that Russia is a long-term threat, but not mentioning that Russia is committing aggression against NATO partner states, that there's a lot of skin in the game, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, but the 5% capability target is something now that allies have agreed on. And it's not 5%, it's actually 3.5% plus 1.5%. 3.5 towards defense spending, the kind of classical way, the way that we would calculate military expenditure, more or less, these are standard sort of ways of measuring. And 1.5% is sort of choose your own adventure, I would say. And this is something that, again, I think Australian government now, when it starts getting these hard questions about how are you going to reach anything, you know, that's a bit more ambitious, right, than to in a little bit percent and so on, should refer back to that 1.5%, because that's anything that's defense related. And I think it was a way to appease Trump for sure, but it also tells us, and I think Matt already alluded to that, and Olga as well, that we have a lot of this gray zone hybrid warfare that's going on, where actually we need to start thinking about how we actually conceptualize investment in security through resilience, you know, through actually whole of society approach, and not just counting how many tanks or submarines and so on we have. And so this is something that's important. Now, in terms of whether Europe, and I'm wrapping up here, if Europe is serious on this or not, or NATO Europe, they've given themselves 10-year deadline. So 2035, which is, you know, for Ukraine, not quite like the sort of, you know, music to the ears of, you know, it's quite urgent. And second thing, again, we still don't have quite the metrics of how we are measuring what 1.5% is, whether this is going to help Ukraine necessarily or not. So where my betting money, and I said, you know, all that about my batting averages, but I think really for Ukraine, it's going to be down to the security guarantees that it gets bilaterally or in these minilateral and kind of nodal modes, rather than waiting for NATO Europe. I think that there are some good signals coming from the EU. It's thinking much more about defense in that sense, but that's not the right platform, because again, that's not the competence of the EU. And again, NATO can't do it as an institution. It has to come from member states. And that's where the ambition and really the sort of rubber meeting the road will be tested.
Thank you, Gorana. So I'm going to ask a couple more questions and we'll rapid fire. Then we'll open up to the audience. And so I guess on Olga, I'd love to hear post-war recovery for Ukraine. What is top of the list for priorities for how it recovers? It can be economically, politically, demographically. What's the biggest challenge in the top priority for Ukraine moving forward?
I think the key word in the question is post-war.
Yeah.
This all will depend on the conditions on which this war will end or be paused or in any other way resolved. If the war ends with Ukraine regaining its 1991 borders, which is ultimately the goal, there will be a few things I wanted to highlight. So first of all is, right now, Russia has occupied about 50% of Ukraine's minerals. So even if we look at the minerals deal, actually a lot of the minerals are currently on the Russian-occupied territory. So of course, if the war ends on fair terms, on just terms, Ukraine will regain access to all these natural resources. At the same time, we need to remember, we all saw what is happening on the liberated territories. We all know that civilians there go through filtration, they go through torture. There's boxes with human teeth discovered and things like that, all gory things like that, that you all know too well that I don't need to talk about. So we know that these are the things that are currently happening on the occupied territories. And it will require a lot of work to document those war crimes, to prosecute those who were perpetrating those, and also to reintegrate the people from the occupied territory. Because in Donetsk and in Luhansk, it's been over 10 years that they've been occupied by Russia. So if you can imagine a child starting year one at school, they're now graduating from school, and we don't know, we don't understand, I think, the true extent to which they have been indoctrinated by the Russian education system. We know that all Ukrainian books have been probably, I don't know, burnt or just like excluded from the school curriculum. We know that the whole curriculum has been rewritten to fit the Russian narrative. So it will be a big challenge. There have been a few defectors from those territories who have in different ways made their way back to Ukraine. And the things that we hear from them are horrifying. So this reintegration of Ukraine's citizens that had been lived under occupation for over a decade will be a challenge and will be a priority.
Thank you. So last question before we go into rapid fire to Matt. Gorana was talking about how, in many ways, NATO set the bar for engaging with the U.S. And before that, I would say, though, before the election, I'd say in many ways NATO could learn from Australia for dealing with the U.S. and how to dealing with a Trump administration in the U.S. But now perhaps Australia could learn from NATO for how to engage with the United States. But I'd love to learn, more than anything else, why does this matter to Australia? And what could Australia be doing more of or even less of?
Jared, I'm really glad you used Trotsky, because I was going to use Trotsky as well.
Excellent.
But that was to bastardize him completely and say you may not be interested in Russia, but Russia is interested in you. That's why it matters to us. It matters to us because Russia considers us on the list of 12 states that it sees as vragi, enemies, right? There's a particularly visceral word in Russia that means basically someone who is completely alien to you. We are on that list, right? Part of it is because we have supported the rules-based order. Part of it is because we've supported Ukraine. Part of it also is because the Russians see us as a potentially very interesting test case, as a US ally, but a fish out of water in a region that culturally has often found itself cut off from. So the Russians try out their cyber on us before they then go and try it out on the Europeans and the United States. We know this to be true. The Russians are also winning the information war in our region and in the so-called global south. We should recall that the only countries that support sanctions on Ukraine within the so-called Indo-Pacific are Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, South Korea, and Japan. And everybody else does not have sanctions on Russia. The Russians are also pushing very, very heavily into Southeast Asia. In particular, I want to highlight the role of a man called Tulchanov. He is the Russian ambassador to Indonesia, and his fingerprints are all over the request/non-request to base long-range Russian military aviation in Papua, in Indonesia. He recently succeeded a woman who was in Indonesia and also in Malaysia. She's gone back to head up the third Asian desk at the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and she clearly has given him instructions to make as much problems as possible for Australia within our region. I was with Gorana in Singapore last year for an Atlantic Council project sponsored by DITRA, the Defence Threat Reduction Agency for the Pentagon. And as an Australian, I had a whole bunch of Pentagon types coming up and saying, why the hell are you so silent in Southeast Asia about the Russians? And I said, and they said, they are, pardon my French, talking a lot of shit about you. And it's happening in a complete vacuum. You're not pushing back. I think there is something to the argument that if Ukraine falls, it is a terrible, terrible signal to those who would want to resist authoritarianism. We know that the Chinese are learning off the Russians. If not in alliance, they are at least in alignment on most things. We know, for instance, that Russians are embedded. Russian experts in social media are embedded in Chinese media organizations, and they are learning. We know also, of course, that the Russians simply do not care about international norms, laws, and order. There is a campaign of sabotage that's currently working its way across Europe. We should recall that if you look at the economies of Australia and Russia, we are natural competitors. We sell the same stuff: iron ore, gas, oil, etc., copper, coal. The Russians are simply going to have to make their pivot to Asia work, because they are going to be shut out of European markets for a very, very long time, even after Vladimir Putin is carried out of the Kremlin in a box. So we need to be alive to the fact that Russia is going to be present in our region, more present and more of a threat. And in order to get support for that, we need to be able to front up and help countries in Europe in order to ensure that NATO, that the European Union also takes it seriously when it comes to security challenges within our own region. And that's completely laying aside the fact that, you know, you have a nuclear armed power in Asia that is a participant in European land wars. It's extraordinary, right? Really part of our strategic longitudes. And I mean, we have treated, I think, Ukraine as being too far away for too long. New Delhi's a long way away. Guess what's closer than New Delhi to Sydney? Vladivostok.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt. Now we're going to do rapid fire, and then we're going to open up to the audience. In maybe 15 seconds or less. Do your best. I'm going to ask you questions. We'll start with Gorana first, and then we'll change it up. Has Donald Trump undergone a shift on Ukraine?
Too soon to tell. One or two data points never make a trend line. That's what I always repeat. There are some of my former postgrad students here. They know that. We are yet to see that, because after the announcement about selling Patriots to, again, NATO member states that would then give it to Ukraine, he also said, well, but Ukrainians shouldn't actually be striking Russia, and, you know, all of these sort of mixed messages. We'll see. Also, the details of the whole deal are still a little bit sketchy, so I'll leave it there.
I was surprised to see Donald Trump admit defeat last week after his talk with President Putin, which I think was a call number 6 with Putin. So Donald Trump never admits defeat. He always denies, deflects. And so this fact really is perplexing. And so just a space to watch.
Well, it depends on whether Grgić is running a secret sort of foreign policy of his own, but let's assume he's not.
And that's
or not
Undersecretary Grgić, the Undersecretary of Defense, who famously wants to pivot everything from Europe and the Middle East to Asia.
The ruthless prioritizer.
Indeed. But let's assume that Trump is in control. No, Trump hasn't changed his mind on Putin at all. Putin called him 10 days ago and said, I am going to go after Ukraine for 60 days. Guess what? Donald Trump came out and said, I'm going to give Russia 50 days to come to the negotiating table. He gets his 60 days. He gets to basically lay waste to Ukraine with 740 Shahid drones and Kinzhal cruise missiles until the next 2 weeks and the next 2 weeks. Trump wants to be serious about changing his mind. Don't send Patriots, send Tomahawks.
Next, is there a credible diplomatic off-ramp? Or are we just locked in a long-term war of attrition? And maybe start with Matt and work our way back.
I'll be very quick. No, there's no incentive on either side to end the conflict right now. If you're Vladimir Putin, you can't take what you've got, which is about 1/5 of Ukraine, and that's only a tiny bit more than you had de facto through Russian proxies prior to the big invasion. And if you're Zelenskyy, or if you're anyone else in Ukraine, given the maximalist goals that Russia has articulated for as its conditions for peace, why the hell would you take that? You'd fight on.
Olga.
I agree, there is no diplomatic off-ramp, and the reason is very simple, that the territories that are occupied by Russia, or that Vladimir Putin would like to occupy but hasn't yet, are enshrined in Russia's constitution. So Russia's constitution was changed to incorporate Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson oblasts into as Russian territories. So in a way, if we talk about is Kursk bargaining chip or not, it can't be, because legally in Russia, the status of those both territories is the same. So they cannot be bargained by definition. And so unfortunately, I do not see a diplomatic off-ramp at this point.
And just to add to all of what has been said, with which I thoroughly agree, the leverage and involvement that there would be to actually effect any sort of change is not being used. So things that US and Europe could be doing still in terms of different types of sanctions and so on are still not enough to actually change the calculus for Vladimir Putin. And what's worse yet, 3 years have passed, and Olga alluded to that already. Russia has been able to switch economy into a full war mode, but not just that, to actually diversify and actually use some of even NATO allies to get its hydrocarbon revenue. I'm talking about Turkey.
All right, now penultimate rapid fire question. What are the metrics of success that you think are most indicative of what happens next and how things are faring economically, militarily, diplomatically? Start with Gorana and then move our way down. 10 seconds or less.
I would use what has been used about Europe following the end of Cold War, and that would be, you know, Europe whole, free and at peace. And I think that that would be a metric of success to get Europe to get Ukraine to be free, whole, and in peace. That's a sort of maximalist goal, but I think the one that I think, given the change in Ukrainian national identity, is one that is by and large supported. Now, how do we get there, and through sort of what sort of stages it will take? That's you know, going to be a long process, but I think that should be the end state, and I think still one that shouldn't be compromised by us talking about it from afar. And I'll yield to Olga because, of course, she's a citizen.
The metric that I'm particularly watching with great interest is that of volunteering in the Ukrainian society. As of 2025, over 81% of Ukrainian adults have volunteered to support the Ukrainian armed forces. And that is a figure, so 8 out of 10 Ukrainians are currently doing something. And that is something that probably allowed Ukraine to withstand what is happening. That's a metric that I'll be watching and just sticking to that.
Very quickly, aid as a proportion of GDP, which is a particular comment on Australia's contribution to help Ukraine. It could be a lot more. The more countries we have donating, as Vasil was saying, funds, but in addition to that, expertise, extractive technologies are things that we're very, very good at. But we're also part of the drone coalition that we should be amping up. All those are other data points, but in fact, it just boils down to simply the willingness of those states who are prepared to stand up to authoritarianism to keep paying for it.
Excellent. Now bring us home, Matt, and then we'll go on the way down. If you have one message to an Australian policymaker watching this event relevant to this topic, what would it be?
Actions speak louder than words.
Excellent.
Invest in Ukraine.
Thank you.
It's not Beijing versus Brussels. You can do both.
Yeah.
I love it. All right, now we're going to open to questions, and key word in what I just said is questions, not commentaries. Now, when we call on you, if you could stand up and give your name and affiliation and keep your question brief, I would appreciate it. So perhaps closest to you, Janine, right over here next to Lily. Thank you. And you have to use the microphone because we're on YouTube as well. Sorry.
Okay, my name's Andrei Barahovi. I just got a question. At the end of World War II, Russia acquired 10% of Finland. When Russia is defeated, do you think countries like Moldova, Finland, and Georgia will be able to get their sovereign territory back as a punishment to Russia?
No. Look, I think it's more of a comment on, you know, when Russia is defeated. Well, Russia is defeated when the current leadership and those who agree with the current leadership leave. And so it's basically a question on Putin's mortality. I've already said that the only way he leaves the Kremlin is in a box because he doesn't trust anyone. The trouble with that, of course, is that after he goes, the successors are likely worse, if not better. So I think it's going to be a while, unfortunately, before we see that.
I strongly agree. I think there is a system right now in place in Russia where the successors will be incentivized to outdo Putin. And yes, that's not too optimistic.
I think, yeah, by all accounts, the moderates have fled,
Or
if
been
been thrown out a window. We had another hand right in front, Janine. Yes, thank you. And then we can move over here.
Thank you very much, David. Looking at the war in Ukraine, particularly about the use of drones, there's a lot of discussion in Australia about how instead of spending money on AUKUS submarine, we should be spending more money on drones. That is like, it is considered to be the future of warfare. I just think about, could you just talk about that or what your thoughts are?
AUKUS these days is about as popular as Scott Morrison's holidays during bushfires. So, you know, certainly in terms of public optics, I think AUKUS is in trouble. That doesn't mean there aren't good things about it. I am I gave a talk last year where I was asked, with a bunch of other people, do you think we'll get the Virginia-class submarines? And I said, no, probably not. And everybody else on the panel said no, including a lot of prominent AUKUS supporters. I'm not sanguine about that. I'm more hopeful for Pillar 2 of AUKUS. The trouble is that AUKUS does cost $368 billion for starters. And you can get a lot of uncrewed capability for that, which will probably be part of the mix going forward. And of course, if we retain defence spending at the current levels, then we are simply going to be just servicing AUKUS and very little else. So I think, contemporary technologies are things that we really, really do need to invest in. Go Shark are good. But they ultimately need to be put onto lethal platforms, and we need to be able to do drone swarms. So we need to be able to project that mass in that respect, and that costs money.
Did you go ahead?
I would just say with any sort of new technology and the kind of bright and shiny objects that have been, now the kind of latest thing. We know this from the history of sort of technological advancements in warfare, that we just need to be wary that there is always this sort of techno hype, right? And a lot of sort of promises, but then a lot of also potential perils if you just, commit towards one and you don't diversify. And I think we do need to have more of these discussions also. Where is it that, drones are succeeding in Ukraine? Where is it that they are not? We already talked about, Russians actually catching up with a lot, like actually stealing a lot of IP as well, and so on. So it wouldn't be good now to, AUKUS, as Matt put it, it's not living through his sort of heydays, definitely. But at the same time now to opt for something as well that has problems. We know for all of the kind of successes, there are issues just as well, because these types of cheap technologies as well can be, again, prone to failures. There are issues now. There's been a lot of talk about the first-person views, drones, and that they're not actually as great as they would sort of promise. And some of these things, again, there are ways to actually render them incapable very fast. So in that sense, I would just urge, the kind of debate on techno hype and techno skepticism and all that. It's something that's kind of cyclical in terms of the, again, different revolutions in warfare. And just urge, again, this is not the platform because this is a rapid fire, right? Or Q&A, which is sort of supposed to be rapid, that we actually spend a little bit more time around, actually identifying how the threat environment looks like today, in 5 years down the line, kind of horizons and so on, and make decisions based on that, and definitely not commit towards only one set or type of weaponry. That would be.
Thank you. Okay, last questions. If you can just raise your hand. I'll take the back two. I'm sorry, in the front. We're out of time. But I think some of our panelists are willing to stay longer and answer if you'd like. If maybe take them one in a row. So we'll just do these two right fast, and then we can.
John, you can hear me? Hi, Louise. I'm actually a former student at the US Studies Centre, as Gorana knows. Is there a logical endpoint to the war, or are we going to be talking about this in 10 years?
Perfect. Perfect question. Next in front of you.
I'm Anton Bogdanovich. I'm Associate Professor of Applied AI from Western Sydney Uni. My question is about technology. So is there a realization that Russia and Iran and North Korea are technological united front, and how deeply invested they are? North Korea alone, the poorest country on the planet, was able to produce multiple times more artillery shells than the entire world was able to produce for Ukraine. And on the technological front, Ukrainian had to invent all these robots and drones to survive. But now, after all these simple solutions have been resolved, now we have the brightest minds of billions of people on the other side working on this technology together. There are entire factories in China mass producing technologies. There are groups of academics and non-academics working on things that here in this country, for example, when I started talking to the defense about swarms of drones, I was told, look, we can't work on it. It's against the rules of engagement here.
Excellent.
So
Thank
how can we win
Yep.
this race, and what happens if we don't?
Very quickly, because we're over time.
I mean, very briefly, so on the end sort of point and so on, I think we touched on that already, unless you sort out the root causes, right? And unless Russia actually becomes sort of a normal continental power, you know, like France or something, like, you know, we can hope. Yeah, I don't see this for all these reasons we mentioned in terms of who might be succeeding Putin. Very briefly on all of the things that concern, I would frame this as sort of deficiencies in the Western defense and technological industrial base that have now been sort of very prominent for quite some time. We are scrambling actually to also produce things that are interoperable. That's something that I think also in terms of why it matters that we actually cooperate across theaters is precisely if there is a contingency, right, that we don't end up realizing that these like 55 millimeter shells actually are like different, you know, 55 millimeters in Italy is not the same in Germany, you know, things like that have now been found out as a result of the needs from the Ukrainian front. So, but then if you go to this level of actually integration of like dual use of talking to scientists, right, and incorporating them there, you know, like the kind of new Manhattan projects and so on, it is much harder in democracies and in capitalist markets to do that because the incentives are different to those. I mean, you mentioned North Korea. They don't need to think about, I mean, Kim doesn't need to think about those trade-offs, right? So people are just going to go hungry and we are going to produce however many millions of shells. We have a different problem as democracies, right, where you actually need to get this social license. And I think unless we actually have conversations like those where the kind of, and, you know, not fear-mongering, war-mongering, but just to explain, I've been in many rooms where people say, you know, in 3 years, AI, like we are dead anyway. So, you know, so I'm not going to even start like going there, but maybe Matt.
Matt and then Olga for closing comments.
Sure. Yeah, look, I'll just pick up on the tech side, if you like. In terms of North Korea is developing the capability to kill many more people. And that's because what the Russians are doing are helping the North Koreans modernize their military. And the biggest worry there is if the North Koreans are able to miniaturize their nuclear warheads and mount them on submarines, right? That would give it a survivable nuclear asset that would be really, really dangerous, would completely rewrite the deterrence recipe book for North Korea. So too would low Earth bombardment systems, which the Russians are also helping with. So North Korea is going to become better at killing people. China and Russia and Iran, I think, are also going to become better at winning without fighting in terms of the ability to manipulate digital environments well beyond deepfakes. The Russians, for instance, have a bit of software called Vulkan, which will replicate the internet in a given place, right? And it will look exactly the same, with the exceptions of the bits that they change. And that has profound implications if you're not able to track that and deal with it very quickly when, you know, you have a country that is willing to go to grey zone and hybrid in order to seize territory, right? Or in order to destroy an economy. So I think in those areas, the worry is greatest.
Excellent. Thank you. Olga.
I think the end will be when Russia is demilitarized, and that is the key to solving this long term. In terms of technology, I think it's only part of the equation, and I do think that the institutional environment that allows scientists to innovate is something that Ukraine has done so well, and something that traditional militaries, Western militaries like we have in Australia, have yet to come to terms with. And I do think that will be that other part of the equation that will allow Australia to continue developing its capabilities.
Thank you, Matt, Olga, Gorana. That was fantastic. Sorry for going over. That was excellent questions. Thank you.